One, two, three, four.
Hello, you're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. We are a general interest independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. This year, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to close our store and cancel in-person events. But SKYLIT is your neighborhood bookstore, and we are finding ways to create community even while we're far apart. In the coming weeks, we'll be putting out lots of new audio content to help you discover new books, connect with authors, and check in with your favorite booksellers. To learn more about how you can help keep SKYLIT alive, please visit our website at skylitbooks.com or check out our social media accounts on Twitter and Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy.
Hello, lovely listeners. Welcome back to SKYLIT. This is the SKYLIT Books podcast series, and I'm your host, Maddie Gobo. I'm the events manager here at SKYLIT Books in Los Angeles. If you're not familiar with us, we're an independent bookstore located in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. We are open right now from 11 to 7 on weekdays and 10 to 8 on weekends. We hope you'll stop by, show off your mask, wave at our booksellers through the plexiglass. We miss you, we love you, we want to see you. All right, so today we're going to have a fantastic conversation with Jim Lewis and Ruben Martinez. They're going to be talking about Jim's new book, Ghosts of New York. And I'm really looking forward to this. This book sounds really wild and really fun. It's out in April from West Virginia University Press. Ghosts of New York is a novel in which the laws of time and space have been subtly suspended. It interweaves four strands: a photographer newly returned to the neighborhood where she grew up after years spent living overseas, a foundling raised on 14th Street, a graduate student, his romantic partner, and his best friend entangled in a set of relationships with far-reaching personal and political repercussions. Graduate students are always getting into relationships like that. And a shopkeeper suffering from first love late in life. Mixing prophecy, history, and a hint of speculative fiction, its stories are bound together even as they are propelled into stranger territory. And I wanted to read this blurb from Sally Mann. It's just a phenomenal one. Jim Lewis sees like a photographer and writes like an avenging angel. All right, so to introduce our guests, let me read their formal biographies. Jim Lewis lives in Austin and is the author of 3 novels, which have been translated into many languages: Sister, Why the Tree Loves the Axe, and The King is Dead. He has also written criticism, reportage, and essays for the New York Times, Slate, Rolling Stone, Granta, and others. And in conversation with Jim today is Ruben Martinez, an Emmy-winning journalist and the author of Crossing Over and Desert America and other titles. He lives in Los Angeles, where he holds the Fletcher Jones Chair in Literature and Writing at Loyola Marymount University. Jim and Ruben, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Maddie. And it's great to be with you, Jim. We are in the virtual ether. You're in Austin. I'm in San Francisco at the moment.
When was the last time we saw each other face to face? Was that in Houston? Was it that long ago? No, I saw you in LA 5 years ago, maybe.
5 years ago, another lifetime, of course. Yes, pre the last 4 years, pre-pandemic, pre everything.
Yeah.
But it's a great pleasure to be with you. And I just want to cue the audience into how I met you, because it's a really sexy story. Set on the streets of Paris, France, not Texas. And we were doing a book festival. We're featuring a lot of American authors, and we were hobnobbing with the likes of Louise Erdrich and Sherman Alexie, and that's where I met you. And and I remember a wonderful fast friendship developing, discussing kinds of matters, historical, literary, and everything else. And we've kept in touch over the years, and even jammed a couple times with guitars in my living room in Los Angeles. So it's really great to connect this way with you. And congratulations on getting Ghosts of New York out.
Thank you, and thank you for that. Was the night I think it was the very first time we met that you recommended Pedro Páramo to me, which has meant so much to this book that I owe a lot to you. So it's really appropriate that we're doing this together.
Well, right on. Let's begin with Pedro, because I'm assuming you ended up writing an essay, in which you were trying to introduce more American lovers of literature to the great Mexican novel by Juan Rulfo named Pedro Páramo, that I did recommend to you at that time. It's a compact little book, 100 and something pages, and it blew open Latin American literature and really opened the doors to what became the boom and what, for better and for worse, became magic realism, which is kind of became a cliche after a while. But there is some good stuff, and that novel in particular stands out to this day. And it's a story because of what happens with the characters. They're kind of ghostly. Here we are, so New York in your book. They're ghostly. Time is very fluid. Narrative doesn't really flow in. It flows back. It's like a tide, sometimes flowing back on itself, back and forth. And Ghosts of New York plays with time a lot, and it is not linear. And these characters that you bring to life, that all share New York, the cityscape of New York, are kind of eventually collide into one another in one way or another. But tell us how this time and space thing, how you arrived at this particular mode of telling the story this way.
What happened actually, I kind of backed into it. I was probably 10 or 12 years ago, I was asked to write an introduction to a book of photographs by David Wojnarowicz called Rimbaud in New York, which are these fantastic black and white photographs that he took of himself and sometimes his lover. It seems it's a little unclear who it is, wearing masks that show the only known photograph of Rimbaud. And they're very down and out. They're on the subway, they're on the piers, they're in sort of burned out buildings. And it sounds a little pretentious in the telling, but they're really fantastic photographs. And I decided to write a short story, and I started to write about that period in New York. Wojnarowicz died in the early 90s, I believe, of AIDS. Started to write about that period in New York, the late 80s, mid 80s, when he was very prominent, and suddenly thought, who the hell wants to read another book about how cool New York was 30 years ago? So I just took what I had written and flipped the tense so that it's all basically set in the future. But it's very strange because, first of all, English doesn't really have a future tense the way, for example, French does. So you don't actually conjugate the verb, you just use will or going to in front of it. So, I'm going to run, I run. So it's a little bit limited that way. And it's also, it ends up being a very strange voice, because even things which are set in the future, even things like science fiction, are always written in the past tense. So this future tense or future construct, I don't know if it's been used in fiction before. It's something you usually find in books of prophecy, in the Bible. And because one is so used to that association, when you're presented with that, that tense, it feels kind of oracular, and you tend to believe it on this level that it's really hard to explain. And I started out writing the whole book that way, and quickly realized that it was going to become tiresome very quickly. So there are only 3 sections that are about 10 pages each that are written in that voice. But all of them are actually set in the past as far as the book is concerned. So all of them are set in the mid to late 80s. I don't know if that makes sense. I hope I described that accurately.
Well, it does and it doesn't make sense, because especially as Americans, we think, and when I say we as Americans, of course, that's a crazy imaginary construct that doesn't exist in real life. But for the sake of argument, as Americans, we don't tend to think of time in any mode other than linearly, right? And the whole exceptional myth of, we're future-based people. We don't dwell in the past. even though the past keeps on kicking our ass over and over again. And of course, we're in the middle of yet another reckoning with the past right now. But the tense that you're talking about, the way it's actually on the page, like in your opening section, is with lines like "they'll have had an argument," which is they will is the future part, right? And have had is kind of like that idea of the tide doubling back upon itself,
Mhm.
tide coming in and
Mhm.
tide going out at the same time, like two waves going in different directions.
Mhm.
And for me, it achieves this very curious thing, and it made me think of Latin American authors like Juan Rulfo or Clarice Lispector, the amazing Brazilian novelist and philosopher, of creating both nostalgia and expectation at the same time. It's a really interesting tension, and we're talking about people moving through time, having experienced loss. There's a lot of loss and melancholy here. Um, and New York, is a city that is just keeps on popping up, and through these characters' lives. So tell me a little bit more about your relationship to New York, which is also your past, and must have something to do with the way you're approaching time and space here.
Yeah, just before I do that, I will say that I think one great exception. I mean, I think you're right about Americans rush to bury the past. But the one great exception, and interestingly, it kind of uses the river metaphor that you're talking about, is the end of The Great Gatsby. That great line about, and so we go on boats. I can't remember it exactly. Beating into the future, or I have the book here. Let me see if I can find it. Well, I won't look for it. Everybody go look at the last sentence of The Great Gatsby, which is just a terrific sort of melancholy, but also sort of propulsive way of ending a book. Boy, New York. I mean, New York is my past. It's where I was born, and well, actually, I was born in Cleveland, but it's where I was raised, and it's where I lived for, until I was about 40. And every time I go back,
I can't think of you as anything other than a New Yorker. But even though you haven't been there in so long, you're in Austin, right? But I
yeah,
think of you as indelibly a New Yorker.
I do too, and I haven't lived there in 20 years. I go back 3 or 4 times a year, so I don't completely lose touch. But one of the things I noticed, which is really striking, and which one may not realize until one leaves and starts going back again, is how incredibly swiftly it changes. I go back now, and every time I go back, the skyline is completely different. Neighborhoods are completely different, not just because of the wealth, although that's certainly part of it, but just because, Gem Spa, which was this great little candy store, egg cream place on the corner of St. Mark's Place, which had been there for 90 years or whatever, it just disappears overnight.
Right.
And so that landscape, more than almost any other city I can think of, except for, Dubai or someplace like that, it just keeps layering and layering on top of itself, and burying its past, in a way which can be really alarming, but which I don't think you quite realize when you live there.
Yes, and it's a cliche, of course, to say it, but it's true in your book. I mean, the city is a character. It's always lurking, and pops up, in street scenes, in the midst of paragraphs, in the midst of dialogue. The city just interrupts.
Mhm.
I just lifted a tiny little bit here, which is Stephanie, your photographer, coming back to New York, after being away and having left it because of loss in her life, and she's coming back, and there's a reminiscence of her relationship with Bridget, who. Anyway, there's just a little paragraph. Just wanted to have the readers hear it for a second. Do you think I'm timid? She asked Bridget on the phone one night. Outside, a car alarm was sounding, and all the skyscrapers were standing with their shoulders thrown back as if they were soldiers in their finest, waiting for the queen to pass on by in parade. Do you think I'm cold? Back to the dialogue. Do you think I'm spoiled? And there's moments like that just the city just erupts, and it's that this was a super striking moment to me. Just the brute eruption of the city into their subjectivity. But what is the city to you in this book? If it's a character, what's it doing?
Well, first, just to go back to the passage you read, because I think this is really striking also. One of the things which I associate with New York, which I don't associate with any other city I've ever even visited, is the noise of it. It's just an incredibly noisy city. And there's no escaping it. Even more than visually, I think the noise of New York is really overpowering, whether it's usually sirens on the street, which were particularly bad during the COVID crisis, but even in general, it's jackhammers, it's people partying, it's and because Manhattan has very few sort of purely residential neighborhoods, it's just inescapable. And that part of it was very important for me to try and capture the sense of literally your conversations being interrupted, or you're having to talk over or shout over. It's like being in a noisy restaurant, 24 hours a day. And again, it's something you get so acclimated to that you don't quite recognize it until you go back. So that part was important to me. What is New York to me? God, New York is dad. New York is your father. It's the authority that loses a little bit of authority as you get older. It's something that you can, even though in a sort of paradoxical way, every time I go back to New York, it looks younger because there's so much new construction, and because there are so many, new people there, and neighborhoods change, as I said, so quickly. But it's still, in some sense, a lot like the relationship you have with your father. You spend the first half of your life trying to please it, and the second half of your life trying to escape it.
Yes, well, you just thanks for bringing my father into the conversation. All our fathers into the conversation. Well, the Aural, Aural city is overwhelming, certainly, and the visual city is also overwhelming. And in that particular passage, we had both things going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Aural
Mm-hmm.
and material visual city. And the book is getting at both the overwhelming materiality of the city, but also its ghosts. Maybe
Well, this
it's
is
not
something.
the central. Go ahead.
No, this is something that the two characters talk about in the first section of the book. One of the things that's really fascinating to me about Manhattan, at least, is there are no cemeteries there. There are no graveyards. There are little ones. There's Trinity Church, and there are a couple of other tiny ones. But almost every other major city I can think of has a huge cemetery right in the middle of it that serves as a reminder that history is long and people come and go, and in the midst of life we are in death, and vice versa. And New York doesn't have that, so it almost feels to me like there's got to be some place for all this consciousness to go, and all of this history to go, because it's it's all shunted off into the farther reaches of Queens, basically.
Exactly. Well, and you do something. It's kind of like you're bringing a cemeteryless city, and immediately I thought of Paris's cemeteries and Mexico City
Yep.
cemeteries. They're like central features.
Havana,
I hadn't
Moscow,
actually.
London, Highgate.
Right,
Havana,
right,
the
right, right.
cemetery. The Havana, the cemetery is basically, the most striking thing about the city in a way, or the most monumental thing about the city.
And of course, in Los Angeles, which stands out among the cities that we're talking about because it's peculiar, far-flungness and strange geography, at least compared to these older cities, grid cities. Los Angeles has Forest Lawn, which is Glendale, And it's kind of a central location, but it kind of floats above the city in a
Hmm.
weird way. That's where Michael Jackson and my grandparents are buried, and my mother are buried, by the way.
Hmm.
My family's within a stone's throw of Michael Jackson's grave, which is that's the way things are in LA, right? The celebrities are actually right there
Right.
among us. Sorry for that little
Right.
digression, but
No, no.
in terms of the dead present, that you have a wonderful section where you just list off a bunch of deaths, across epochs, across decades, so and so heart attack on that corner in 1955. So and just like snapshots. And you have tried your hand at photography and have collaborated with photographers and written on photography. And you're giving us these snapshots of the dead, revealing them to us. And I think photography is just kind of like it's always latent for you as a theme in your work, both because you've practiced it and pondered it. And clearly Stephanie, she's a photographer, right? And you're
Hmm.
and also the way you capture things visually. Give us the what's what is photography doing for you here in this book, and what does it do in your life?
Well, I think photography is endlessly fascinating to me. And one of the things that's fascinating to me about it is that it really didn't exist 150 years ago. Um, so now, if you ask most people what they would grab from their house if their house was burning down, most of them would say old photographs. I'm not sure how much this is still true in the digital age, but it certainly was true for a very long time, because they are our memories, and that's the way we remember things is through photographs. And when analog photography was around, it was even stranger because you would take all these pictures, but you wouldn't know what you were going to remember until you got the pictures back from the photomat, which was, sometimes a week later. Um, the other thing about photography, which I've always found really fascinating, is more than any other visual art, it was open to women, and Jews, and it's a very much, especially street photography, is very much a New York kind of phenomenon. Um, so when I had this character who was female and was Jewish, I think I had those in place before I decided that photography was going to be her vocation, because it all just kind of clicks together. But in a larger sense, I think photography is simply our most tangible form of memory, and in some cases, our only form of memory. Um, you know, my
Hmm.
mother died about 3 months ago, and one of the things that has come about after this is all of us kids. There were there were four, there are now three, have been exchanging old photographs of her, which the rest of us haven't seen because all of us have a couple of them, and most of them are photographs from before we were born, and without them, I would have a very different sense of my family. There's a picture of my mother with her father and her grandfather and her great grandfather, um, and without that photograph, they would just be names. Um,
Yes, and photography is how am I going to say this? I mean, the photographs are ghosts, aren't they? I mean, they're. I mean, it's like I know they're a material thing. I have a book of photography on my desk right now. I have Taxi by Joseph Rodriguez, my wonderful friend, and Richard Price, somebody um, that you know as well, about New York. I mean, it's a material thing, although it's become a virtual thing also, and there's a shift that occurs with that. But the material thing, it's almost like I can put my hand through it, right?
well, it's made out
There's a
it's
ghostliness.
made out of light, ultimately, and it's probably the first thing human beings ever had that was in a causal relationship with light in that direct a way. And so there's always going to be something slightly kind of spectral about them, because they're capturing images which are gone, and they're capturing them by way of this very immaterial seeming substance.
And
Um,
yep, and we're looking at them on our walls.
mm,
They're just right there. And so it's like, and the ghosts are telling us that we're ghosts too in some way. No, um, that's the spectral aspect of it. But photography also transforms the way we regard the city in particular. You know, if what painting did for the pastoral, painting could do in a particular way, but photography does the city, doesn't it? Doesn't it transform the city? I mean, in terms of
yeah, especially New York. I mean, obviously there's like Ansel Adams and stuff. So it records nature on some level, but nature doesn't change the way cities do. So you don't look at a photograph of, Mount Bonnell and think, or Mount Shasta and think about what it looked like 200 years ago, because it looked pretty much the same. Um, but I think photography is associated with certain cities. It's associated with New York and Paris for the most part through
Mexico
acting.
City, Mexico City.
But I'm sure there is one, but I don't know what the tradition of photography in Portland, Oregon is. Um, so I don't know if it's automatically universally urban or if it's very much a kind of New York thing. Again, it's also very much, at least in America, about Jews. It's Robert Frank, it's Diane Arbus, um, and you don't have big Jewish communities in a lot of cities. So you don't necessarily have that same tradition. And also, New York is incredibly photogenic. It's really hard to take a bad picture of New York. And I'm not quite sure why. I don't know whether it's because it's all orthogonal or, because there's so much artificial light, or because it's so busy. But it's only Paris that I can think of is as photogenic. And I don't know whether that's just because I'm used to photographs of the two of them or whether they are particularly conducive to being represented that way.
Well, we could talk about photography. I mean, forever, because it's an endlessly productive subject, and I
I
think
don't
like
know,
most,
like
yeah.
what is the photography? What's the photography of Mexico City like?
Oh my God, it's. I think I have my shorthand for the places that I'm most intimately connected to because of family and heritage are Mexico City and El Salvador.
Mm,
One's a city, one's a country, but El Salvador is a very tiny country. It's about the size of Mexico City. um, but I always say that El Salvador is a land of poets, and Mexico City is the land of photographers. That it's like it's like the ICP, right? International Center for Photography in New York, the great school and
mm,
exhibition space. You've got the Centro de la Imagen. It's right there in the center of Mexico City. It's like the city regards itself through photography. It was also, an amazing, still amazing cinematic capital, right? Um, New York didn't become the cinematic capital. LA did for,
right.
all kinds of different reasons. Light, especially, right? The quality of the light that we
Weather,
have.
yeah, lots
Yeah,
of
you
sunshine.
know, but Mexico City regards itself as with the beginning of the modern. Mexico City is I always say Mexico City is the first great modernist capital. It inaugurates the modern with the revolution, and the revolution is photographed. You know,
Hmm.
the revolution was televised, in Mexico City from 1910 to 1917.
But see,
And those ghosts haunt us today.
but here's an interesting thing. I was in Beirut a couple of years ago, and I was talking to a bunch of photographers, and there's a lot of photography in Beirut, and it's a very photogenic city. And I asked them why photography was so prominent there, and they said it's because of the Armenians. The Armenians all brought photography with them when they emigrated to Lebanon. Um, is there a population that in Mexico City that carries this tradition, or is it more generalized than that?
The, a specific population. I mean, there was so much interaction between Europe and Mexico City. I mean, if you're anybody in Europe, in the arts at the turn of the 20th century, you had to go to Mexico City, right? That was the emerge. It was fertile territory for modernists
Mm-hmm.
because it had the quote unquote primitive thing, right? You could go and look at indigenous people and pretend that you were in a diorama of the Aztec past, on the one hand, right? One of modernism's obsessions. And on the other hand, it was an incredible metropolis that was designing itself with all kinds of innovation in the urban sense and in architecture, design and architecture, right? It was imitating Europe to an extent, but there was also something else going on. It's a super complex thread of colonial history and then technology, right? I mean, Mexico City was arguably much more modern a capital, right, at the turn of the 20th century than were many places in Europe. But how do we get down this rabbit hole?
I don't know.
Now we're discussing Mexico City as the modernist capital of the world, which it is. I argue forcefully. But back to, let's get off of the photography and modernism track for a second, because there's another wonderful part of your book that I read with. You have a music section. One of your characters, Caruso, the foundling, raised by an African-American couple, is an extremely talented musician. And you have an extended scene where he's appropriating a song and making it his own and putting and producing it. So we're in the studio. And it's a stirring scene. It made me think immediately of James Baldwin, another New Yorker, who writes books, short stories like Sonny's Blues and many other scenes from the novels. He writes so well about music made, which is not an easy thing to do. You know, I think music critics have kind of like their language for it, but to render music performed live and in the studio, you're still performing, right, in a way, is not an easy thing to do. But this is an arresting moment where just the magical, the alchemy of musicians communicating with one another in the studio is an incredibly vibrant scene in the book. Tell us how it just looks like you had tremendous fun writing that section.
It was really fun to write, and it came from probably 6 or 7 years ago. A friend of mine down in Austin, who I've been friends with for a good 20 or 30 years, who's a singer-songwriter, a guy named Michael Fracasso. I guess he's got about 8 or 10 albums out, and I'm always talking to him about his stuff. And so he invited me to produce a record with him, which I did, or produce a record for him. And I ended up playing on it also, kind of holding on by my fingertips. And it's incredibly fun. And it's so much more fun than writing, and it just reminded me that pretty much everything is much more fun than writing. But there's something that happens in the studio. I think the studio is kind of a mysterious place. You see a lot of movies about movie sets, and you see a lot of TV shows about TV shows and movies about TV shows. But I think a lot of people don't really realize how a recording works, and there are very different ways that it can happen. In this case, they're all together and they're all sort of recording live, slightly isolated from each other. But there is this kind of magic that happens. I felt it, and it's unlike anything I've ever experienced. I think probably the closest thing to it is playing a sport, a team sport, where you just know where the other player is, and you pass the ball without looking, and you're just all working together towards this common goal. And it's a really striking feeling.
It's what I love. You used the line to describe that very process. A wonderful simile, like children in pursuit of a butterfly. It's safe to say that no one has used this particular simile to describe the process of a bunch of musicians coming together and grooving and on the spot, and the alchemy that occurs when a song finally gels. And the description of it, is meticulous, and is kind of like the equivalent. D.A. Pennebaker has a wonderful documentary of the original Broadway cast recording of Stephen Sondheim's Company.
Oh, I love that. The Elaine Stritch performance is one of my favorite things ever in that
Yes.
documentary.
Yes, and I thought of that. I thought, whoa, is this going to go in the Lane Stritch direction? Is there going to be a meltdown in the studio? A little bit too much drinking going on in the studio, or is it going to be like Didion describing the Doors in the White Album? You know, everybody just waiting around for Jim Morrison to show up. But it's a classic. I brand this a classic of the genre, which is not easy to do in writing. I don't know if you share that idea that it's not you don't often see really writing about how music is made. There's a challenge there about it.
Yeah, it's funny because I think I spoke to you about this. I just read Charlie Mingus's autobiography for probably the second or third time, though I haven't read it in 20 or 30 years. And it's great, and it's complete madness all the way through. But there's very little in it about music. It's mostly about women, and that was a little bit disappointing because it is really fascinating to read. How these things are made. And one of the things that I ended up doing was reading a bunch of books as I was getting ready for this, because I had no idea really what a producer did. So I read a bunch of books by producers, and they're the ones who are kind of have the most bird's eye view of the whole thing, because they're not in the middle of it playing, but they're sort of half in the middle of it. And if it works well, they're very much in tune with the people who are playing. But I also think, with the exception of Dylan, maybe there aren't a whole lot of musicians who are really good writers. So it's kind of hard. It's one of those things that it would be hard for an insider to do, I think. Though I don't know. I mean, I guess they're good books about sports. I don't know if athletes think so, but
Well, yeah, why don't we I do want to widen the lens a little bit, if you'll allow me that metaphor, since we were talking about photography. You're a wonderful journalist and have
thank
a
you.
lot of experience writing different parts of the world, war, violence, extreme violence, Republic of Congo, for example, so many years ago. Um, and I'm in Latin American letters, the relationship between journalism and the novel is just kind of like is very clearly established.
Mhm.
Most novelists were or continue to be
I
journalists.
didn't know that.
That's just kind of like you are you do reportage, you do criticism, you do first person essays, all in your local newspaper,
Hmm.
right? Opinion
Hmm.
pieces, as well. Yeah, you've got you're a five tool player in journalism, and you write a novel every 2 or 3 years. That's just kind of like the Latin American literary job description.
Hmm.
And in the United States, oh, and you probably do some poetry on the side. In the United and I don't know if you've ever tried your hand at poetry, but I just described you essentially, you know, and I don't find that varied literary job description to be very common in the United States.
It's not, and I think there's a
You
really
know,
specific reason why. I mean, to me, they're very, very different activities. They're, you know, they're both writing, but they're very different kinds of writing, and so I don't think of them as quite as related as maybe a Latin American author would. The fact is, in a very banal sense, most literary writers in America need another source of income. And so you can teach, which I don't want to do. And I'm not really qualified to do because I've never taken any writing classes. You can do Hollywood, which is usually the last anybody ever hears of you. You can work a regular day job, which one of my favorite poets, a guy named Franz Wright, did for years and years. He worked at a children's hospital. Or you can do journalism. And for me, journalism which I kind of got into accidentally, was very easy because my father was a journalist, my brother's a journalist, my mother was a journalist for a little while. So it's something that I kind of grew up with. And so just kind of knowing how to do that kind of reporting is kind of second nature to me. But I wish I could say there was something profound in that connection for me, but it really is a day job. It's a great day job. I mean, it's a really fun day job.
I'm gonna push you a little bit on that. It's like you saw a massacre in the Republic of Congo.
Afterwards, yeah.
Right?
I mean, I didn't see
afterwards.
it happen, yeah.
Yes, you came upon the scene afterwards. This was something that that will be a haunting for you forever, right?
I basically divide my life into before then and after then. Yeah.
I can imagine. How is that a day job? How does that not show up? How does that show up in some profound but maybe not obvious way in your?
You must be right. Just as an aside, when I was there was during the publication week of my last book, which was absolutely perfect. There's nothing better than being 8,000 miles away in the bush with no access to telecommunications when your book is coming out. It was really kind of perfect in that regard.
I stumped him.
Yeah, you kind of did. I wish I had an easier answer to this. I think there's a great line of Norman Mailer's where he says, a writer becomes mature when they realize that something out there isn't kidding. And I think that was kind of a revelation to me that this isn't all a game, and that and finding that out in the most sort of brutal way. I mean, it's not like I was flippant about it before. One is always searching for a way to find some kind of seriousness without being precious about it. I think that when I came back, I just felt like I was on a different planet, which had much stronger gravity. So I was kind of stomping around a little bit more. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, the cliche is the world. Yeah, you re-enter the place, your home, after an experience like that, but the home is transformed. You can't. It's not. Yeah, it's not the same. Nothing's the same. I mean, I carry around the violence. I've lived with violence. My father drove. James Baldwin in the famous No So Native Son describes, the smashed plate glass and fires of the riots in 1943. I was 3, 4 years old. My father leaving the house during the Watts riots. A generation later, I covered the LA riots after having covered the war in El Salvador. And it's just, and then the narco violence of the last 15 years in Mexico and Central America. And it's like I woke up one day, middle-aged, and realized that my entire adult life and even early childhood is just like relentless. It's violence. It's one chapter of violence leading to another with these little breaks in between, but not much of a break.
It's funny because my brother just told me, which I didn't remember, that during the Newark riots in '67, my mother brought me and my brother down to Newark to protest. I would have been 4 years old, and he would have been 6. And coming from a news family, sometimes in an indirect way, but the late '60s and '70s were a very violent time. One of the things about the Congo, though, I think that really affected me was that the people who had died were, nobody's ever going to know who they were. There's no system for registering births. there's certainly no system for registering deaths. So, this carnage just gets literally buried by the side of the road and people move on. And what we think of is that, I'm sure there are ceremonies and there's mourning and there's grieving, and there are ways of making some sort of permanent mark that this person existed. But if so, they were invisible to me. And so there's this terrifying sense of somebody being born and then living and then being murdered, and leaving no trace behind at all, no record, no nothing.
Yes.
Which and I think part of what that did to me in terms of this book was this idea of trying to save the dead, of trying to, of trying to recommunicate with them, make sure that they're remembered, and make sure that the effect that they have on the living is made explicit, for people who might otherwise, not get an obituary in the newspaper, or have a big church funeral, or have a gravestone or something like that. And I think of the AIDS crisis also, and what carnage that was, and how cast out a lot of those guys were. And it's not the same as dying anonymously, but it is this sense of having, of their friends having to sustain their memories, in many cases because their families wouldn't.
Oh, Jim, did we lose you, or oh, there you are.
Sorry, did you get the end of that sentence?
I don't think I did.
Oh, I was just talking about, a lot of the men who died of AIDS, their friends had to create memories of them because their families wouldn't, frankly.
Yes. And this completely puts me in the frame of mind of Ecclesiastes, quoted by James Agee. Let us now praise famous men, which is, of course, not about famous men. That whole passage in Ecclesiastes turns on the idea of all, not the kings, not the poets, not the ones who had the big funerals, not the ones the Hollywood Reporter, talks about, but the ones who lived invisibly.
Yeah.
And yet Ecclesiastes says, but these were men of mercy, and they shall be remembered forever, is the final line of that. And for James Agee, that was the poor white tenant farmers in Alabama.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is so, and that's that. And of course, Agee was working with Walker Evans, the fabulous, Depression era photographer, FSA, project, and which brings us back to photography.
I think they weren't they on assignment for Fortune or something like that?
Yes.
I don't think
and I think he would.
I don't think the particular
project per se, but yeah, but right. But he did FSA work too, I believe. But at any rate, the photographic register, both in and the book is both writing and photography, right? And your writing, man, is like photography. There's a great photographic quality to it, and you're on the way you're honoring these otherwise invisible lives, is very, very touching, very moving.
I have to say,
I like what you've done here.
I had an interesting experience when I used to teach a course at Columbia called Lit Hum, which is this kind of Homer to Virginia Woolf year-long literature class, and one of the things we would read was the Bible, and I had them read the Song of Solomon, and they couldn't figure out, there are lines in there like, your breasts are like young roes, meaning baby deer, and they found that sort of comical, and I realized at that point that contemporary culture is so used to thinking of visual metaphors, that the idea that something would be like something else basically means it looks like it. that's what they were missing, and that's why they were reading it and going, "Well, I don't understand this." So and I'm very visually oriented, but I really try to make an effort to include sounds, include smells, because that's one of the things also about New York that's really distinctive to me is the smell of restaurants, and restaurant garbage, and kind of restaurant dumpsters. Um,
Yes,
which
yes.
you don't get anywhere. The smell of wet concrete, which you don't get anywhere. The smell after 9/11, which nobody will ever forget, whoever experienced that.
Mhm, mhm,
I
mhm.
have to kind of stop myself sometimes from getting too visual, because I think it's just limiting yourself in a way which is completely unnecessary. And I also want to mention, just before I let you talk again, if you look at the first edition of Hart Crane's poem "The Bridge," there are photographs of the Brooklyn Bridge that Walker Evans did. There are the first photographs he published, and they're absolutely beautiful, and they go so well with the
Mm.
poem, which also, that poem has a relationship to this book that's a little bit hard to explain, but one of the chapters is named after a line from that poem. But
Huh.
anyway, Evans seems to have
Well,
cooperated with writers a lot.
yes, which brings us to kind of like Susan Sontag territory, right? Regarding the pain of others, and what I always took away from that particular essay was uh, the photograph without, not always, but often, a photograph without a caption can just, can without a real caption, a well done caption, that offers crucial context, um, uh, that comes into synergy with the visual image, um, is what safeguards the image from being battered around ideologically and potentially put uh, at the purposes of evil,
Say that
right?
again. I'm not quite sure I understood you.
A photograph without a caption is like, you're the one that's good with similes. I don't have the simile for it.
Are you saying a photograph without a caption is dangerous, or that it's safe?
That it can be extraordinarily dangerous without, and I'm talking about a real contextual, a text that is
Yeah.
both commenting, exploring, critiquing, uh,
Yeah. I
in
mean,
dialogue
captions
with the image.
captions can make photographs lie too. You have to be a little bit careful about that, because the wrong caption and you'll start seeing things that aren't actually there. I think
Mhm.
photography, one of the things I love about photography is it's very dangerous and it's very amoral. Um, you know, I think uh, um, I think the archetype of a photographic image is basically pornography. I think Sontag is right that photography is completely exploitive, and
Mhm.
that's kind of what I love about it. Negotiating that inherent vice is part of the
Ouija.
photographer. Is part of Yeah. I love Ouija, but
Mhm.
he's a deeply immoral guy in a lot of ways.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I think that dangerousness is kind of what makes the medium so great. Is to what extent you give into it, to what extent you try and circumvent it. It's not a moral activity. Um,
Would you say the same thing about the novel?
Certainly in some hands, yeah. I mean, I think the novel is a little bit more moral these days than I would like it to
Yes.
be.
Ah. Uh-huh.
Um,
You mean pious
I
in the
mean,
pious sense, piety.
yeah. I mean, the good triumph, or if they don't triumph, then they're recognized for their suffering. Um, there are all sorts of, this book, had to go through what did they call it? And I don't mean to sell out my publisher here, because they've been absolutely great. But they put it through a reader who's only there to look for possible political incorrectness. Um, and my editor apologized for it and said, just ignore this, and I did. Um, but I think,
And this
um,
is a common thing. This is a common thing these days. This is there are, what are they called? The readers that do this.
Yeah, I
the
can't. There's a name for it. I can't
there
remember.
is a name for this. I'm blanking on it too. But yeah, this is de rigueur, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I sense you chafing
Ah,
against it.
sensitivity readers, Maddie says. Yes.
That yes, sensitivity. Of course. So and of course the novelist in you, the modernist novelist in you goes WTF, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, and I'm not saying that, the novel should be poisonous. Um, but, I think the novel should, a novel could be or can be and should be allowed to be um, difficult, in some cases outrageous. I mean, gay literature wouldn't exist if everybody was playing by the rules of the game at the time it first started coming into prominence. I think I said this to you on the phone the other night. I've never really been able to get myself to believe that art should be good for you.
Mhm.
And I
Well,
think we live in a culture that, now that said, this is not the most outrageous novel in the world. I'm not interested in, épée de la bourgeoisie. I think that's kind of a silly reason to do anything. But I'm also not really interested in giving any kind of moral instruction. And um, I think writers are forced to worry about this in a way which is understandable, but which I don't
which you don't what?
cotton to. That was a Texas phrase. Um,
The so yes, and and of course, if we had live chat here, we would get into this huge thing about cancel culture and political correctness and the like. And I mean, it's complicated territory. I mean, it's not just novelists that are facing it. It's professors in the classroom with
yeah,
warnings.
and that's not even what I'm talking about. I think the novel is essentially a bourgeois invention. It's created for people who have a lot of free time, and are willing to spend it on that kind of leisure. Um, and so it tends to reflect bourgeois values
Mhm,
traditionally.
mhm.
So even the whole PC thing, which is part of what I'm talking about, but it's not the entirety of what I'm talking about. If you compare like the original Grimm's fairy tales, which are absolutely brutal, to Jane
Yes.
Austen, you can see where a certain kind of bourgeois morality kind of creeps into things, and that's fine. That's the prevailing morality. And I think if you're comfortable with that, then that's the way to write. But it would never occur to me to use a novel to try and make somebody else a better person.
So that begs the question, why the novel then? Why the novel now?
It can do things nothing else can do. Just as music and movies can. There are, show me a movie that's written in the future tense. It's impossible. There's no such thing as tense in a movie. All movies are written in the present tense, which is why all screenplays are written in the present tense. So, and one of the things I try and focus on, especially in this book, because I spent, one of the reasons why it took me so long to write this book was I spent so long trying to figure out what a novel could do that nothing else can do. And there are things, they're kind of hard to describe. They're modes of rhetoric, forms of address, kinds of edits and cuts, and the way things move around, the pacing of it, the way you have your reader's attention on the end of a string and you're kind of guiding it one way or the other. Um,
Mhm.
Linguistic things which can't be done in any other medium really, except maybe poetry, but most poetry isn't narrative. So I think there's always going to be room for the novel. It's a form of art, and it's a form of art that um, is as distinct as ballet is. Um, Now it may end up being a sort of rarefied pleasure for some people, but I can live with that.
Well, yes, and I'm glad you wrote this book. And so,
And
because
thank you for
I've had fun, a lot of fun reading and talking to you about it, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I hope I haven't been hectoring you, but we do tend to disagree about things, and that's why I love you.
Likewise, I'm sure. Love you too, brother.
Take care.
Thank you both so much. What a great conversation. And I love thinking about the things a novel can do that no other form can do. And Jim, I think your answer was fantastic for that. So thank you both. Jim, thank you for sharing your work with us. Ruben, thank you so much for the great questions. This was a really meaty conversation, and I think our listeners are going to enjoy it. So
thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Maddie.
Happy to have you, and I hope we get to see you in the store in person, hopefully in the coming year.
Yeah, next time I'm in town.
Next time.
And Ruben,
Right.
Ruben, I'll see you next time I'm in town also, yeah?
Absolutely.
All right, take care, brother.
All right.
Peace. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.
I see